my screen. Okay, so the site is pictured here as the red feature at the centre of the slide. It's situated just to the east of Central Staines, immediately east of Spelthorne Leisure Centre and just north of Knoll Green. Now, prior to the field work, the site was a previously undeveloped parcel of land. In 2021, we began excavations on site in advance of the redevelopment of the leisure centre. Now, today I will be focusing on the prehistoric findings, but I'll just give you a brief summary of all the findings on the site. At the southern part of the site, at the southwest part of the site, there's this large grey linear feature. That was a paleo channel, which is currently undated. However, we did recover organic material from the base of that feature, so we're hoping that carbon-14 dating will help us establish when that was an open channel. Across the site, you can see dispersed pits of various dates, prehistoric right through to Roman and post-Roman, but there was no obvious major focus of activity in terms of the pitting. We also had two linear ditches, which you can see in the sort of central northern part and the southern part of the site on northeast-southwest alignments, and these are almost certainly Bronze Age or later filled ditches. And then the two most obvious features are the two large ring ditches in the central southern part of the site. We also had quite a lot of metal finds from the site, which included some quite interesting coins, and I'll talk about those as well, but I will be focusing mainly on the prehistoric findings. Okay, the first identifiable activity on site in terms of date was a small group of 3 pits, which were located around about 10 metres north of the northern ring ditch. All of these pits were cut into the natural sands and gravels. They weren't particularly large, around about 1 metre or just under in diameter, and around about 70 to 80 centimetres in depth. All 3 pits contain very distinctive, dark, almost black, basal, charcoal-rich fills, over which was sand infill. Now, from these pits, we recovered numerous artifacts, including struck flints and lithics. These have been looked at by Hugo Anderson Weimark, who confidently dates them to Middle Neolithic. As well as struck flints and lithics, we also recovered bone fragments, some of which have been burnt or had been burnt, and also pottery fragments. And these artifacts have yet to be looked at by specialists. In terms of the flints, we recovered a total of 260 from the 3 pits. The finds included scrapers, serrated flakes, striker light, chisel arrowheads, and a polished discoidal knife. As a group, Hugo thinks that these were intentionally selected. These weren't just rubbish. They were quite an unusual selection of finds. And he also thinks there's evidence for intentional breakage and burning. Now, I must confess, I don't know how you identify intentional breakage and burning on flints, but I'm sure that Hugo will flesh that argument out in the final report. As well as the struck flints, we also recovered a polished stone axe, which you can see in the slide there. It was the blade end of the axe, and Hugo thinks that the stone was group 7, which is provenance from North Wales. So it's ended up quite a long way from its original source, which is not unusual for relatively high status Neolithic artifacts. So quite an interesting finds assemblage from these pits. How do they fit into their landscape? This slide is showing the wider landscape. The site is the red dot at the centre. The black squiggly lines are contours. They're not that relevant because it's essentially flat in this area. The blue squiggly lines are showing the river channels as mapped by Ordnance Survey. And what they show is a sort of an abraded stream and river system that sort of cuts across most of the landscape. And that drains generally from west to east towards the Thames. The green thick line at the top of the slide is the known extent of the Stanwell cursus. I'm presuming that you know what a cursus is, but for those who don't, it's a double ditch feature often associated with a bank or banks, and they tend to run across landscapes for long extents. Basically, I think the longest one is Dorset, which is 10 kilometres long. Now, in terms of the Stanwell cursus, the northern extent, I think, is the terminus, or was the terminus. That's the known terminus of the feature. At the south, that's the known extent. It probably ran further to the south, but as known, our site is located approximately 3 kilometers to the southwest, but it was probably nearer back in the Neolithic, and it's likely that the pits were at least partly contemporary with the Stanwell cursus. So that's the wider landscape. In terms of interpretation of these pits, when they undertook the excavations at Terminal 5 Heathrow, which was just to the east and partly incorporating the Stanwell cursus, they opened up large areas, and across these large excavation areas, they often encountered isolated or small clusters of pits that were very similar to the ones that we found at Spelthorne. And these pits were often associated with Peterborough ware and groove ware pottery. And there was some evidence for deliberate deposition of selected pottery and various finds. And so our pits seem to be fitting into that model quite well. The interpretation generally of these pits is that they're probably commemorations of temporary or ephemeral or transient settlement sites or gatherings. And so we find these across the landscape. No particular focuses, I don't think, have been identified. They're generally just scattered across the landscape. Population would have been relatively low, and the landscape would have been mainly wooded. But possibly the Stanwell cursus was acting as a focus for this activity. But yeah, sort of scattered pits across the landscape representing temporary occupation sites. And the pits at Spelthorne seem to be further evidence for that in the Middle Neolithic. So moving forward in time, we have the 2 ring ditches. This is a drone photograph of the ring ditches viewed from the northwest looking towards the southeast. In terms of their size, the southern ring ditch, i.e. the ring ditch furthest from the camera, was around about 18 meters in diameter, and the northern ring ditch was slightly smaller at 14 meters. In terms of their overall appearance, that they fit quite comfortably with what you'd expect for a Bronze Age or prehistoric funerary ring ditch or barrow ring ditch. In terms of the ditches themselves, they were relatively ephemeral, normally around about 80 centimeters wide, around about half a meter in depth. They were cut into the top of the sands and gravels. Now, the shallow nature of the ditches, at least in part, is probably due to later ploughing. As you can see from the drone photographs, after we recorded our sections, these features were excavated to 100% sample. And the reason we did that was to increase fines recovery. Having said that, we did recover finds, including pottery, Bronze Age flints, and some bone fragments. But on the whole, the finds were actually relatively rare. There was a paucity of finds from these ring ditches, which is not uncommon for these funerary monuments. So looking further in detail at each ring ditch, the southern ring ditch, there wasn't actually any features demonstrably associated with it. We had a number of pits interior to it, but none of these could be demonstrably associated with it. And there were no burials associated with the southern ring ditch. So there's not a huge amount I can say about the southern ring ditch. We had a little bit more luck with the northern ring. So this is a plan of the northern ring ditch with the sort of features within or around it. And note firstly that it's not actually a ring. Down at the southwest, it flattens out, so it's not quite a perfect ring. We don't know why that happened, why they flattened it out at the southwest. There is an idea that perhaps they were having to avoid an extant feature or monument that we have no evidence for, but I suspect we'll never really know. Down at the southeast, we had a cluster of pits. All of these were excavated to 100%. There were no finds from any of the pits or chalk or any other anthropogenic indicators. It's not entirely certain whether those pits at the southeast were archaeological or whether they were geological solution holes. At the northwest, we had the pit coloured red, and that was clearly cut through the fill of the ring ditch, and it contained ceramic building material and a fragment of metal nail. So that was clearly a later feature. That was nothing to do with the ring ditch itself. So we had one feature, which is coloured green. It's just off centre within the area defined by the ring ditch. and we'll have a look at that. So this this slide coming up, hopefully, this is showing you that feature at the centre of the, or just off centre in that ring ditch, immediately after the machining phase. And what you're looking at here is the sands and gravels, and there's a sort of cluster of flints and cobbles. It almost looks natural at first glance. However, after a rigorous hand clean, it came up much more convincingly as an archaeological feature, a tight cluster of what appears to be fairly tightly packed flints and cobbles. And so after planning, it's half sectioned, and it revealed that the feature was actually a fairly shallow sub-oval pit cut into the top of the sands. And that had been lined with these flints and cobbles. And within that matrix was an upturned or inverted ceramic vessel. Hasn't been looked at by specialists, but it's almost certainly a collared urn, which is Bronze Age, datable to 2000 to 1500 BC. And as I say, it was inverted, so the rim is towards the base of the pit. And note that the cobbles extend across all of the basal profile of the pit, presuming that the cobbles were fairly loose when first placed into the pit. That would suggest that they would have to have dug the pit, placed some of the cobbles in, placed the urn upside down, presumably in some sort of leather bag, onto the basal cobbles, and then pack further cobbles around the urn. So quite a careful, convoluted infilling. The upper part of the feature where you can see the broken pot, that's the truncation horizon. That's the part at which everything else above that point has been obliterated by ploughing. So we don't have the base of the urn or anything that was contained therein. After recording, on the basis that this was likely to be a cremation urn, we lifted it as a block so that the contents of the urn could be excavated at the laboratory under micro excavation conditions. And I'll just show you a photograph of that because it's quite an interesting result. So this is the urn back at the laboratory, and they're undertaking their micro excavations where they excavate by centimetre spits and record everything as they go. And it's the osteoarchaeologist that's excavating at this point. And this photograph shows you that excavation around about 7 or 8 centimetres down into the urn, working our way towards the rim. And you can see here fragments of beige fragmentary material, which is just the cremated bone, which is what you'd expect from a cremation. But note, there's not a lot of charcoal. And in fact, most of the contents of the urn comprised fairly clean sand. So perhaps counterintuitively, this cremation urn wasn't filled with just ash and charcoal and bits of burnt bone. These bones seem to have been carefully selected, possibly even washed prior to deposition in the urn, and there isn't a lot of charcoal or other detritus. There were no identifiable grave goods within the urn, but there were cremated bone. So the osteoarchaeologist has written a provisional assessment of the cremations, and they can identify the remains of at least 3 children, all of whom were less than 9 years of age. And a nice little detail to come out of the micro excavation was that the osteoarchaeologist identified that there was commingling of the skeletal elements between the individuals, which suggested possibly that these children had been cremated together, which may require some explanation. I said there were no finds from or grave goods within the urn. Hugo has identified from all the cobble packing material, he did identify 2 early Bronze Age flake cores, as well as a Mesolithic blade core. And the Mesolithic blade core would have been a couple of thousand years old by this time. So these are potential intentional depositions, although there is a chance they could just be accidental inclusions into the packing stone material. Okay, so how does this fit into its wider landscape? Well, again, relatively comfortably. Referring back to Framework Archaeology and their work at Terminal 5, when they were considering this period in their reporting, they suggested that in the Heathrow area, collared urns incorporated the remains of the dead, making claim to land. Sometimes these cremation burials are marked by small earthen mounds or barrows. So our 2 ring ditches at Spelthorne seem to fit with that general model quite comfortably. Although I would point out The idea of claim to land is usually based on the idea that barrows and these sort of funerary ditches contained the ancestors, and that gave this idea that legitimised your idea of claiming to land. That may not fit quite as comfortably with the fact that we've got 3 children being buried in one of these ring ditches. Having said that, the ring ditches themselves have been ploughed and truncated, so there may have been other burials with older individuals that we just have no evidence for. We'll never know, I'm afraid. Okay, so topsoil and subsoil finds. During the machine strip, we undertook a metal detecting survey through topsoil strip and the subsoil strip, which yielded some really interesting finds and was actually really worth doing. So I'll just run through those. So the earliest find, metal find from the site was this gold stator of Tassiovanus. Now, Tassiovanus was, as it were, the king of the Catavaloni, and their oppidum, or their main camp, was up at Valamium, which is now St Albans, and that's where this coin almost certainly was minted. My understanding is that the southern boundary of the Catavaloni was around about the Thames, so this coin is at the southern area of their territory, so it's not particularly out of place, but it's a fairly rare and lovely find nonetheless. I say the metal detecting survey was really successful. I must confess this was actually spotted by the machine driver whilst we undertook the subsoil strip, so fair play to him. Murray Andrews has had a look at the Roman coins from the site. We had a total of 58 Roman copper alloy coins dating from mid to late 1st to late 4th century, and which is perhaps not unexpected given the proximity to the Roman town, and they're entirely typical of what you'd expect in this area. And some of the pits that we had scattered across the site were exclusively associated with Roman materials. So we've got evidence for activity in this period, but it's not necessarily that unexpected. However, a few of these coins were particularly interesting from a later perspective. I'm going to read this slide entirely. Right, it's the wrong way around, but I'll read this slide entirely. It is of some interest to note that 6 of the late Roman coins from the site had been deliberately pierced with a small round hole, presumably for suspension. Similar finds of pierced Roman coins are well known from Anglo-Saxon and Frankish inhumations of the 5th to 7th centuries, where they are likely to represent objets trouvé converted into amulets for the deceased. These coins could therefore represent reused objects displaced from disturbed early medieval graves in the immediate vicinity of the site. Now, these late Roman pierced coins therefore provide a hint that Anglo-Saxon burials may have existed in close proximity to the site. Although the evidence is clearly slight, this is an intriguing possibility when we consider the 2 Bronze Age ring ditches within the site, as we often find that Anglo-Saxon burial grounds in the Middle and Upper Thames Valley targeted prehistoric funerary or ritual complexes. As well as the late Roman coins that possibly pierced and reused in the Anglo-Saxon period, we also had this silver skate. So apologies for the fuzzy photograph on the right. This is early to mid 8th century. And it's not an uncommon find in the Thames Valley. However, they are more often than not found at Middle Saxon meeting or trading places, which themselves were often sited at or near earlier burial grounds. So we have these sort of coin evidence suggesting that we've got some rather interesting Anglo-Saxon archaeology in and around the site. One to watch this space in the future, I think. So, other finds from the site, we had Roman brooch fragments, medieval and post-medieval coins, Crossel and Hawkin bells, a silver ring, which has just been declared treasure trove, a chape, strap end, lead weights and pins. So rather interesting metal finds assemblage, all of which needs to be looked at by specialists once we've completed the field work. So key takeaways are Middle Neolithic pits representing probable transient or ephemeral settlement or gathering within the site, possibly related to gatherings around the Stanwell cursus. Early Bronze Age barrows, one of which contained 3 child cremations. That date 2000 to 1500 BC, we should be able to get that tied down with carbon dating. Roman settlement ? Well, we've got some pits with exclusively Roman pottery and some coins, but no focus. So just evidence that there's Roman activity around the site. That's why there's ? there. And hopefully it's going to come up Anglo-Saxon burial. Anglo-Saxon burials, ? We haven't got any burials. I can't say there's an Anglo-Saxon burial ground here, but there are hints that we may have something like that in the area. Definitely want to look for future field work, especially any metal detecting that occurs in and around this area. And I will end there.
That's brilliant, Andy. Thank you ever so much for that. We will just see if anyone has any questions they'd like to put in the Q&A box. So I will abuse my position as I've unmuted myself. I'm really intrigued by the idea that the 3 children might have been cremated together. They've ended up in the same pot. Are you dating them separately?
I would imagine so. Yeah, we're still undertaking the field work, so we will be sort of defining the sort of the research aims at that point. But it seems like a sensible thing to do. If there's material that we can, it seems like a very sensible idea.
It'll be interesting to compare them to the Fennings Wharf barrow at London Bridge, because that's got a number of children, and very interesting when you get so many children in such close proximity. So I'll be interested to hear your results later on.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Great, thank you for that. That was my question. We have none in the Q&A box.
I'm happy to ask one, Jane, if
okay, go ahead, Harvey.
Time to do so. Okay, Andy, how much of that site in the prehistoric period do you think is actually used by people who are still largely using the landscape for hunting and gathering rather than farming? I mean, there's becoming more information now, I think, about a lot of the early Neolithic or early to mid Neolithic being more related to moving hunting communities rather than farming ones. How does that strike you in terms of the evidence that you've got?
Well, yeah, I completely agree with you. I think the early Neolithic is more Mesolithic than Neolithic these days. I mean, I have to say though, if it is contemporary with the Stanwell cursus, that would have presumably been a major draw and a major sort of focus of their, not only their sort of movement, but also their mindset. That would have been a monument where the first major clearing has occurred in the landscape. So yeah, whether they're hunter-gatherers or farmers, I think it's perhaps a false dichotomy at that point. They're probably a little bit of both. Well, we know they're a little bit of both. But clearly that monument is a signifier of great change, because there's nothing like that in the Mesolithic, and clearly things are changing.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, looking at monumental landscapes, aren't we? All aspects of monumental landscapes once we get to the question of the cursus. Well, thank you, Andy. I think that was a very well done lecture, if I may say so, and I think brought the site to focus, and it's quite nice now to be looking at the outside